Hello and welcome to volume 44 of Ask a Brit, the show in which I ask you fine people to ask me any question you like so long as you use the hashtag #AskABrit and so long as your question is within the theme that was laid out at the end of last week's video, which in this case was the royal family. And what a week it's been. This past Sunday, of course, was April Fool's Day and Easter Sunday. I didn't let either of those two things get past me. For April Fool's Day, I did concoct this April Fool's joke, which was read by tens of thousands of people, some of whom, maybe half of whom, believed it. And how could I let Easter get away from me without Instagramming my breakfast and lunch and dinner? But enough rattling on, let's get to the questions this week about the royal family, and stay tuned until the very end of this episode to find out next week's topic. So we had a couple of questions come in regard to next in line to the throne. So Pips K asks, in your opinion, do you think Prince Charles or Prince William will be the next monarch? Well, my opinion counts for bugger all, I'm afraid, Pips K. But in terms of, who's going to get there first, obviously by the line of succession, Charles, of course, is next in line to the throne, but that is obviously going to depend on whether Queen Elizabeth II outlives him. I mean, who knows at this point? She's going strong in her early 90s, so you never know. I'm not wishing for it either way. It might look like it with that smile on my face, but there was a rumour going around, spread mainly by me, that Prince Charles was adding salt to the Queen's food to, shorten her life. I'm making all of that up. Don't take that as gospel, okay? Much like people did with my April Fool's joke. It's just a joke. It's not real. But would I like to see William get there before Charles? I don't know. I kind of feel sorry for Charles at this point. I mean, he's had to wait so long to become king that let's at least give him his moment in the sunshine. There isn't much sunshine, of course, in England to be had. Plus, he'd be indoors most of the time to stay away from the public. But at least give him his moment. So I do want Charles to get there. But William, he'll have plenty of years. And then his kids as well. So there is that. And on a similar note, Sasha Thompson, do you think William should be able to rule instead of Prince Charles? Again, I don't believe so. Of course, there is a line of succession, and they're going to follow that line of succession unless, of course, Prince Charles is incapacitated in some way. I don't know what that way would be, and I'd hate to speculate. Okay, on to our next section. So we had a couple of questions come in about favourite monarchs. Mr. F's 101 asks, who is your favourite historical British royal and why? At this point, from the point of view of many things really, influence on American culture and just, the appearance of this person in popular culture in recent years and her influence on the artistic world at the time, then it would be Queen Elizabeth I. Plus, I do like a redhead. I married one, I have to say that. Gingers. So I can see what Meghan Markle sees in Harry. Okay, and we have a sort of similar question from Mark Oldgeezer, who says, who's your favourite royal overall? And I think that more pertains to the royals presently living. It's a tough question, that. And I think that, unfortunately, I might have to give the cliche answer that it is just Queen Elizabeth II. I think it's unbelievable that she has reigned supreme, as it were, for what is now a record of longevity in royal history. 65 years or so, and it's just marvellous. I mean, if you see if you put that in an American context and see what's changed during her reign, it's incredible. I mean, when she came to the throne, I mean, the film Singing in the Rain hadn't yet hit cinemas. Harry Truman was still president. The US had only 48 states. Alaska and Hawaii hadn't yet been admitted to the Union. Albert Einstein was still alive and wasn't by then an American citizen. And she's still alive. She's still on the throne. It's remarkable. For that reason and many others, I would say Elizabeth II is my favourite living royal, even if that is a little bit of a stereotype. And speaking of which, okay, some more questions here from Mark Oldgeezer, and I will say that I think these questions were put to me by Mark with a sarcastic tone. I think he's quite aware that the questions he's asked are supposedly stereotypical questions that are asked by Americans of British people. But one of those, of course, okay, I've got to ask you the standard questions. Do you know the Queen? Okay, so this is funny, this one, because, before I moved to the US, I'd heard of this stereotype and just thought, oh, people don't actually ask that. That's ludicrous. And sure enough, I've lived in the US now for about 10 years, and I've only been asked it once. It was actually 3 years ago when I was working for a different company to what I'm working at now. And we were in a training class, and there was this one gentleman who did take me aside, and he did ask me that question, or at least, did you live near the Queen? Or it was something like that. And I did think he was joking. I thought he'd picked up on this sort of stereotype and thought, I'm going to play with this. He wasn't. He genuinely meant it. So it does happen. It does get asked. I will say that. And Mark Olgiza also asks, what is the Queen like in person? How does she take her tea? Does she have her scones with clotted cream, then jam on top? As I pointed out earlier on, I think if Prince Charles had his way, she would take all of that with additional salt. I hope I'm not putting any ideas into people's heads with any of this. I mean, she's going to outlive us all, let's be honest. And why not? She's a remarkable lady, And speaking of the royals' popularity, that brings us on to our next batch of questions, so stay tuned or just keep watching. So this is an intriguing question. Susan Kay asks, why are Brits so enamoured with the royals? I mean, the history of inbreeding, oppression, cruelty, etc. would seem to turn most people off. You're asking the person who loves Henry VIII. So I don't love him. If he was alive today, I'd think he's a shit, and I'd call the police. What else can you do? Yeah, I know it's true. It is a bit weird. We do have quite a checkered history, as it were. But I think that's part of it. It's part of this romanticism that we kind of like. And also one of the reasons that I'm fascinated with the royal family, and I should add a caveat there. I'm more interested in royal history rather than the current state of the royal family. I'm not somebody who would go out and read the National Enquirer, for example, for any reason at all, because their stories are all lies. The royals, or at least the person that was the monarch at a specific time, it's a good marker, it's a good way to learn history by going through each of these royals and seeing what they did and how that impacted that time. They're kind of your dot on the map, as it were, if you were sort of looking at history as a map. As I often do. I often wake up screaming about things like that. So, that's one of the reasons I look at it that way. And a sort of similar question from Vicky Clark. Why do you think people in the US are so fond of royals? I think partly it goes back again to what I was just saying about the romanticism of it all. The idea of princes and princesses. I mean, you've just got to look at the reaction to the fact that Meghan Markle is marrying into the royal family, an American marrying into the royal family. And it just sort of, I think it brought out in a lot of people this sort of fantasy that you can marry into something that just seems like an archaic system to many Americans, who might also see, the royal family as a quaint alternative to the political system that they have here in the United States. Of course, in the UK, the royal family is now mostly a symbolic entity, but nonetheless seems quite appealing in that way. And the English Journey says, I'm not a big fan of the royal family, but still feel hurt when people mock them. Are we brainwashed to love them from an early age, or is this genuine love? It is for me. I feel it for Charles. No. How do you feel when people mock them in the US? It's true, isn't it? You take on this kind of ambassadorial role. I mean, I do that for a lot of things, not just the royals, but language, food, and just places back in the UK. If they're mocked by anybody, your instant go-to is, I'm going to thump that person. I wouldn't do that, that's violent, but it is, you get angry inside, and then you sort of calm down and realize, well, this could be a teachable moment, where I stand here before you and tell you, well, actually it's not quite as bad as that. It is in the case of Henry VIII. Since I've lived here, I've become more of an appreciator, is that even a word, of the royal family, because I'm looking at it through the eyes of somebody that no longer lives in the UK. And I should say, by the way, going back to what I was saying a moment ago about why people in Britain love the royal family so much, it's not entirely true that we do. There's actually large groups of people that are anti-royalist, and they have their reasons for doing so. Back in the day when I lived in the UK, I wouldn't say I was anti-royalist, but I was just sort of indifferent. And I think a lot of people also fall into that category back in the UK. But since moving here, I've developed an appreciation for them, and specifically their history, which is why, in fact, yes, I do get angry when people mock them. Sam asks, do you think there will ever be a time when there won't be a monarchy in Britain anymore? Great question, Sam, and interesting one to think about, because if you think about it, previously the monarchy took on a much more central role in British life. They were the overlords of British laws. They fought in battles, they conquered other countries and things of that nature. And then their power in that regard was then sort of more handed over to the British government, with them taking on that more sort of symbolic role. And that's more or less where we're at today. So is there going to be a kind of third shift in that regard, in that we sort of do away with the royal family? I don't know. I think if it does happen, it's going to take a long time, especially given the inbuilt traditions that go along with it. Of course, we've got a line of succession that is not going to stop at Prince William. So there's Prince William's children, George and Charlotte. And then they'll have kids, and it'll keep going in that respect. So it could be a while, I think, and especially with all these royal weddings that are being thrown our way. We've got 2 this year, and that brings me on to our final batch of questions. So here's an interesting question. Belinda Joy asks, do most Brits know that Meghan Markle will not be the first black woman to marry into the royal family? So I was very intrigued by this. I myself was not aware of this story, but I looked it up. And it turns out that Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, that's the wife of Mad King George III, and I actually name-checked Charlotte recently in a video when I was looking at states that were named after British monarchs. And it turns out that Charlotte may have descended from King Alfonso III of Portugal, and specifically his wife, who was herself of African descent. But, there are historians that sort of dispute this. Buckingham Palace hasn't denied it either way, whereas it's kind of an indisputable fact, of course, that Meghan Markle's mother is African American. And so obviously there's quite a direct link there to black heritage for Meghan. And the final question today comes from Julie Anderson, and Julie asks, do you think Fergie and her daughters will be in attendance at Harry's wedding? I don't know. I hope she brings the rest of the Black Eyed Peas with her, though, if she does, because her singing recently of the national anthem was terrible, the American national anthem. You mean a different Fergie. Sorry, there is that other Fergie, I forgot, manager of Manchester United for 26 years, Sir Alex Ferguson, and what a guy. I mean, how many trophies? I'm being facetious, Julie. I'm sure she received an invitation. Gingers unite, Harry and Fergie. I didn't receive an invitation. I'm still waiting. But, they've got a couple of months. They can get their acting gear. Okay, that's it for this episode of Ask a Brit. Join me next week when, to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of the release of 2001 A Space Odyssey, we will be discussing films. So get your questions coming in about films. Until next week, cheerio. Thank you for watching this episode of Ask a Brit. Don't forget to hit my stupid little face to subscribe, and please share this video with the world. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and if you'd like to support this channel, please do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond.